I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Lani Kass, former Senior Policy Advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Special Assistant to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, Senior Mentor to USAF Project CHECKMATE, Director of the Cyber Task Force, Professor of Military Strategy and Operations at the National War College. Since retiring from government, Dr. Kass has served as Senior Advisor to the Center for American Defense Studies, Senior Fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, Senior Vice President at CACI International, and a member of the Board of Visitors at the USAF Institute of Technology. Dr. Kass is a graduate of the National War College, National Defense University, holds a PhD from the Kaplan School of Economics and Political Science, and a joint PhD from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. So, Lani, welcome back. It is a pleasure and honor to have you with me, and thank you so much for your career of service.
Thank you, Tim. It's always a pleasure to be with you. You're my favorite interviewer.
Well, thank you so much. So today we're talking about Canada, Greenland, and U.S. national security, and we're going to be talking about Russia as well as China. And so I want to start with President Trump's recent remarks about Canada and Greenland joining the U.S. as new states. This caught me completely off guard. So let me ask if you were also surprised and what your initial thoughts were on it.
Yes, so when I first heard it, I was as surprised as you. And then I remembered from the first Trump administration, the 45th US administration, take him seriously, but not literally. So seriously, if you look at that, it reflects a strategic focus which the United States very much needed, because prior to the inauguration this January, 100 days ago, the United States was focused almost exclusively on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and when those ended, on stirring up trouble in Ukraine. There is now a refocus at the strategic level, looking at the world on a globe rather than a screenshot of a map.
Yeah, and this is where Canada and Greenland both come into play.
Yes.
Because both of these are Arctic nations, and so we have a lot going on. Global climate change is going to be playing a role in changing water passages, right, for bases and military shipping and things like that. So there's a lot that plays a role in the Arctic Circle that is opening up, I guess.
Absolutely. So the Arctic, the polar ice caps have been melting for a long time. This isn't exactly news. What is news is that we are paying attention to it. That has significance in both military and economic terms. So again, if you look at the globe, especially from the polar projection, meaning where the thingy that holds the globe comes to the top, you will see that for nations like China, trade through the Arctic Sea will make shipping faster and therefore cheaper. So that's the economic aspect of it. In military terms, that area known as the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, GUK gap. Again, not a very elegant acronym, there is no good way of saying it, but it's the body of water separating NATO, from Russia and China. At the time of the Cold War, obviously, the Soviet Union and China. So focus on Greenland, this large island belonging to Denmark, which Denmark cannot possibly defend, makes sense. And just to show you how much it makes sense, throughout the Cold War, the United States maintained 17 military bases in Greenland. We are down to one. And that base is really focused on space, not...
Yeah. Well, yeah, and again, so this is so my take on this is Trump is not just out for resources. Both of those nations have resources, but he is looking at a valid, established strategic concern, I guess.
Absolutely. And again, a strategic concern and a strategic focus that goes back to President Reagan. If you remember, President Reagan's approach to defeating the evil empire, meaning the USSR and the Warsaw Pact, had two elements. One was the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was designed to put a protective shield over the continental United States, thus effectively nullifying the Soviet advantage in offensive strategic weapons. Because if I can protect every American city and every installation in the United States, it doesn't matter how many nuclear missiles you have, I'm defended. You know, that magical shield just deflects all of them. Now, can you say Iron Dome? This is the natural or Golden Dome, as President Trump corrected himself. You know, Israel has the Iron Dome, we're going to have the Golden Dome. But the other element of winning the Cold War was what was known, and it was highly classified at the time, supremely highly classified at the time, was known as the Maritime strategy. And under the aegis of this strategy was a concept of controlling Soviet exits from its ports on the eastern side, thus relieving pressure on what could have been during the Cold War the Western Front, where NATO and the Warsaw Pact faced each other. So the idea was, if you threaten Russia's or the Soviet Union's eastern flank and its fleet through that GIUK gap, you will cause the Russians to turn around and not march on Paris. That was that. So during the Reagan administration, the Soviet Union realized it cannot possibly compete. We outspent them, and we had a huge technological advantage. Soviet Union collapsed. But after that, we turned elsewhere. Russia being no longer a threat, we turned elsewhere. This is, to me, a resurrection of a strategic perspective. I'm not making a value judgment. You can fundamentally disagree with it. Not necessarily directed against Russia, but directed against the rising Chinese threat, which I would term a pacing threat, meaning it like a pacemaker in your heart. It is what causes you to take your strategic steps. It paces you.
Let me get into some of my facts and figures. I
Sure,
jotted
sure.
these down last night for you. Canada
Very
has about,
impressive. I noted.
oh, yeah, about 10% of the population of the United States. Canada's GDP is similar to the state of California, and about 90% of the Canadian population lives within 100 miles of the U.S. border. So, more or less, the population of Canada is kind of a belt along the border, and then you do have some cities and metro areas that are a little bit further north. And again, a lot of this comes down to kind of the cold size, difficult weather, and things like that, right? So people want to live in those warmer areas where it's easier to, just do commerce, grow crops, the whole 9 yards. Canada is a massive nation, but in terms of population, it is more similar to a state, although a large state.
Right.
So I'm kind of like you. It's hard for me to envision Canada as a U.S. state, but the town that I live in, we have a big statue here that has "Children of a Common Mother" written on it. And so Canada is family at the very least. All 10 provinces, I believe.
Well, if you recall, and I forgot the name of the French prime minister to before the current prime minister. I forgot. It wasn't Pompidou. I forgot his name. But he made a visit to Canada right after that referendum and urged the Quebecois, the residents of Quebec, to join France.
Okay.
Now we're talking back in late 80s, early 90s. So it's interesting because you said children of a common mother, and you were obviously referring to the British Empire.
Yeah.
But the French have a claim on Quebec.
Yes. Well, this takes us into the colonialism aspect of it. And one of the interesting things, it's almost like wheels within wheels with this, So Trump mentions Canada and Greenland, and then it brings up all of these issues. And a lot of this goes to, I think, our perceptual bias, right? Like, we look at the map, and like you said, we see the U.S. or Europeans may see Europe, and we don't think that, Russia and Canada are right over the top of the globe, right? So
they
some of it is
always look at the polar projection. The Russians do.
Yeah. And then another aspect of this is just historical bias, I guess. As Americans, we're taught in school that we come from, many different nations, backgrounds, and things like that. But it's something that I think it's easy to forget. And so both Canada and Greenland are independent nations with colonial origins. And one of the things I wanted to list off was like some of the other areas that are similar to that. Before becoming part of the U.S., the states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas were all part of Mexico. Then Alaska was owned by Russia, and the territory that would become parts of 15 U.S. states, including Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, as well as parts of Minnesota, New Mexico, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, those were all part of French colonial territory. Right, that we got through the Louisiana Purchase. So a whole lot of the United States originated as somebody else's colonial territory.
Absolutely. And when I read it, when you sent me your questions, I'm like, wow. I mean, I obviously knew about the big pieces, but I will bet any of your listeners right now, I don't think any of them know that. Yeah, they would say, well, New Mexico and maybe they remember that part of Texas was Mexican territory. They think the Louisiana Purchase pertained only to the state of Louisiana. I mean, the breadth of it is largely unknown.
Yes, it reminds me. This is maybe relevant, maybe completely strange, but I had read someone who was talking about the holiday tradition of Christmas, and they
Hmm.
said that one of the interesting things about Christmas, just as a tradition, is that when something changes in it, and things change all the time, right? We tend to reverse propagate that and believe that it's been there the whole time, right?
Right.
And like when they every Christmas they do these specials on how the holiday has changed, and they're like, oh well, they used to do candles on the tree, now we do lights, or they didn't used to do presents, or all of these little changes. Like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer started as a marketing campaign. That was the big
Sure.
one. And similar to that, I think that the structure of the United States, for me, it's kind of the same way. It's like, well, Hawaii's always been a state. Well, no, it hasn't. You know,
No.
Alaska, same thing,
Right.
right?
Right.
So,
Right. And so based on what you just said, imagine you are sitting in the White House and you're saying, okay, my predecessors made the Louisiana Purchase, bought Alaska. And next, I guess is not the correct way, but grabbed Hawaii and Guam and the Solomons and Puerto Rico. So why not extend an offer to
yeah.
Canada and Greenland? There is almost a Me Too aspect to it. An imitation. Yeah, if President McKinley did those things, why can't I?
And Trump would likely view that as a way to help secure his place in history, right? He would be the president who
Absolutely.
added the. Now, I want to get into Greenland a little bit. It is
Sure.
an autonomous territory in the Kingdom of Denmark. It has
Right.
about 56,000 residents. So the entire, island, and this is almost a continent-sized island. This is massive, right? It has less population than a typical mid-sized American city. Over 80% of Greenland is covered in ice, and
Yeah.
politically, the residents are all citizens of Denmark. So Canada as a state, that has a whole big set of challenges. With Greenland, I wasn't even sure what to make of it. I mean, they are tiny even compared to Alaska. So,
Well, they are all tiny, but again, in a conflict situation, Denmark could defend them only as a part of NATO.
yeah.
So Denmark owns a territory which is orders of magnitude larger than itself. I mean, Denmark is a
Yes.
tiny country, which it has zero military capability to defend if challenged. Now, if NATO relationships were a little bit better, and if Ukraine wasn't such a giant distraction, it is possible that the issue of Greenland would be raised in a NATO forum, and it wouldn't appear like we're trying to take something that belongs to an ally. But the subscript there is the ally cannot defend it. We cannot strategically afford to lose it. Therefore, we need a little bit more presence. And as I mentioned, throughout the Cold War, we had 17 military installations on the island of Greenland. And the Danes were super happy that we were there. And the residents of Greenland experienced an economic prosperity they have not experienced since. Now we have a single base. So, I mean, like anywhere in the world, why do you think Poland wants American bases on its territory? Yeah, it's a security guarantee, but it's also an economic boom because you have people also, you have fixed the roads, they buy on the local economy. It's like why congressmen and senators would not allow any reduction in military installations, even though the Pentagon wants it, in their home states, because it's the economy, stupid.
Yeah, yeah. So it would be in some ways good for Greenland. Now,
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
With the research that I did, and I didn't write this down, some of it there was some reading between the lines, I guess, when I was reading up on this. But in terms of what I've read, Denmark as a progressive, social nation, right?
Yes.
They have very good social services, medical, things like that for Greenlanders. Greenland is considered a county of Denmark, I guess administratively, that's how they position it. The thing that was interesting, and again, I don't have a good read on this, was they had said that Greenlanders have their own unique culture, and this goes back a long ways, right? And I believe it was after the 1950s, Denmark started to basically bring them back into Danish culture. And so in some ways I'd wondered, is there some friction there, right? Because that's something that we've had trouble with Native Americans. We're saying, okay, you're an American, so forget your culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Native Alaskans. We used to say Eskimo, right?
Yeah.
That's not a politically correct term anymore.
There was a big push for assimilation, and I think now we realize that wasn't appropriate, right? We're basically wiping out their culture. And so there may be some friction with Greenland and Denmark in the same way.
If there is, you would have to be able to read the local language because that would never make it into the mainstream media. But to your point before, Denmark has indeed one of the best cradle-to-grave social safety net.
Yeah.
I would bet you anything that the main hospital in Greenland is not anywhere close to the level of the Royal Medical Center in Copenhagen, which wouldn't be unusual, in the remote parts of Alaska. You also don't have very good services.
Well, and this goes back to the global climate change aspect of things. So Greenland has been, my perception is that Greenland is a bit of like an outpost. And as the climate changes, I think we're looking at just, it's becoming more of a player, I guess, right? And so things like the economy, things like mineral resources, things become more accessible, rights of, yeah. So,
you see, on the mineral resources, so the country that is the most wealthy in natural resources is actually Russia. The problem is most of those resources, much of this mineral wealth, is under permafrost, and trying to get at it is not economically viable. So it's the global warming and the recession of the polar ice caps will open that and make it more economically viable or sustainable to get at those resources for everybody. So Russia will have better access to its own resources. I mean, Russia is the only country on the planet that can be completely autarkic, meaning totally independent of any import of any of those strategic minerals, because it has them all.
So let me get into Russia a little more then, because I mean, again, that is we would say the bear in the room, for lack of a better term. I mean, it seems like Trump has this interest in Canada and Greenland that is economic and military in nature. He also seems to be working on improving relations with the Russian Federation. Would that reduce this as a strategic concern?
No, absolutely not. For two reasons. Even during detente, we've always been in a trust but verify posture.
Okay.
So you might deal with the bill, invite the bill for dinner at your house, but you never trust it completely not to turn on you. So that's one. But the real tiger in the room is China. And again, look at the map from the polar projection. So China's coast is right there, directly above, north of Russia.
Okay.
So China is the long-term pacing threat.
Okay.
And we have been talking about it since the Obama administration, which came up with the notion of the Pacific pivot. And I remember saying in a high-level meeting, great powers don't pivot. Great powers can walk and chew gum. But we weren't able to, unfortunately. Trump is now reorienting to the Pacific. Look where the Secretary of Defense just visited. Look where he is not going. Just today, he canceled the meeting with NATO, the Ukraine support group or coordination group. So Secretary Austin was there at every monthly meeting. Secretary Hagsett just came back from the Far East, from the Pacific, and going to Europe. What do you think that is? That is the pacing threat. Pacing means like a pacemaker in your heart. It determines the rhythm and the sequence in which you do things.
And so they're saying it's China and not Russia.
Yes. Okay. Totally not Russia. As I said to you in our previous exchanges, Russia is not the natural enemy of the United States. China is.
And that's based largely on economics, right?
Yes, absolutely. Not just militarily. Not just militarily, but in economic terms. Russia is not our natural enemy or competitor. China wants to be the dominant Pacific power. So does the United States. You never heard Russia, which has a very large Pacific coast, say we want to be the dominant power in the Pacific. I mean, even during the height of the Cold War, you never heard Russia saying that, or the Soviet Union saying, you know, we are the Pacific power, we want to displace the United States. The PLC is saying that every single day.
Yeah.
So China is the long-term threat.
Now,
Uh,
I
Go
had
ahead.
taken this in a different direction,
Sure.
I guess. And I was up late doing research, and so, this could
But you
just be
did a
lack of
great
sleep.
job.
Well, thank you. I was looking at, I found an article that talked about basically Putin's history is built on blood. That was what the author was saying. And then as
Okay.
I started to read through it, they talked about Russia annexing Georgia in 2008, which I think is easily forgotten. And then he has troops in Syria and Kazakhstan right now. And then, of course, there was in Ukraine in 2014, which is still going on. Can we draw a comparison to World War II with Poland and then the invasion of Denmark and Norway?
Well, absolutely not. But first, let me correct
Okay.
you on the facts. Not you, but whoever your source is. Russia did not annex Georgia. Georgia is an independent, sovereign nation. Russia did engage in a short conflict supporting the secession of two independent regions of Georgia, Abkhazia and Ossetia. Most people have no clue. Both are independent. Nothing has been annexed into Russia. It's a total, I don't know what, whoever the source is, got that. So Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, and I don't mean Atlanta, Georgia, Tbilisi is an independent country, which, like Ukraine, is dying to join NATO. Georgia, by the way, is the birthplace of Stalin. Very few people know that. Ukraine is the birthplace of Khrushchev, but let's leave those little factoids aside. So in 2008, there was a minor skirmish over the secession of two independent regions of the independent state of Georgia. Okay,
Okay.
both of them seceded. They are independent. Nobody except Russia, Venezuela, Syria, and Nicaragua, and somebody else recognizes their independence. The West recognizes them as lost provinces of Georgia, kind of like Taiwan is a renegade Chinese province, right? But Russia did not annex Georgia, ever.
Well, this takes me off my questions list entirely, but this is something that I have seen. Um, their Western media seems to pick up this vibe, I guess, from whatever the administration's priorities are. And for the last decade or so, we've been hating on, Russia, right? And so, anything that Russia does, if it's, internal handling of disputes, like you're talking about, right? This is a complex issue, and I know that there are several others that are like this. By the
Right.
time it makes it to Western media, it's Putin is evil.
Totally
Putin did something
twisted.
bad, and
It-
and it's not to say that he's not evil. But my thought is it's complicated, right? And you could do the same, and I've seen the same thing done with American stuff. You take a complex issue, right, in American politics, and by the time it makes it to whatever foreign media outlet, they boiled it down to something so simple it has no meaning at all. So in terms of
But you see,
Russia, is
Tim, let
it,
me back up for just a second. I'm sorry to interrupt. You're 100% correct. We've been, the media especially, been hating on Russia, as you
Yeah.
said. And this is, to me, probably the most interesting aspect of what has happened since the end of the Cold War. And specifically, more recently, I would say since 2008, when Putin became the Russian leader. Yes, he is KGB, okay? Don't we have CIA people in positions of responsibility? I mean, come on.
And I'm going to get myself in trouble saying this, but every time I hear him speak, he sounds rational and
He
balanced,
is
and he makes
rational.
sense.
That's
And
because he is rational.
so I mean, I wish that we had people who could speak like that, because when our guys get up there, it's fire and brimstone and hate-filled rhetoric, right? And with him, it's kind of like, okay, here's what's happening, here's why it's happening, here's what's going on. I'm like, okay, you know what? This makes sense, and it doesn't
Right,
align with what the media has been showing us
right.
about him.
You see, most Americans believe that history is yesterday. And it's very difficult for us to understand a perspective of countries, be they European, Asian, African, or Middle Eastern, or whatever, that are looking at history from a perspective of millennia. China is, Russia most definitely is. So go back to what I was trying to say. I have never seen anybody make such a mistake saying
Hmm.
that Russia annexed Georgia. I mean, it's idiotic. Georgia is a member of the Partnership for Peace, has observer status at NATO meetings. I mean, it's just, it's not even fake news, it's ignorance. But the
Yeah.
key point I wanted to make to you, Tim, and your viewers, the average Russian never hated Americans, ever. At the height of the Cold War, you would go on official negotiations like arms control negotiations, and you talk to the average Russians, the maid at the hotel, the taxi driver, the waiter, whoever you talk to, they would immediately harken back to World War II, the alliance. We are so much the same, Russians and Americans.
Yeah, I'm part of the transhumanism and life extension communities online, and those are largely populated by people from Russia and Eastern Europe. So I'm connected, on social media with tons of people from, and yeah, and just average professionals. And not only do they not hate the U.S., one of the interesting things I've noticed is because of commercial imperialism, right? They watch our movies, they watch our TV.
Right, sure.
Obviously, they have YouTube and all that stuff. They buy, going back to the Cold War, and during the Cold War, the Russians were after our cigarettes and T-shirts and rock music. Now they
And
have
jeans.
all of those things and jeans. Yeah. So, in many ways, they are Western, but then in terms of how they view the U.S., many of these folks come here for conferences. Many of them come to the U.S. for vacation. I have one young lady who lives down in Los Angeles, and she's always posting photos from like Lake Tahoe and all of these different American places that she visits. So, yeah, now I don't see that with China. I don't have a lot of folks that I'm connected with there, but that could be the language barrier. That's something
It's
I've
also a
wondered.
very different culture. Very different culture. I don't know if I ever told you this story. Um, I was in China with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on an official delegation. And contrary to most official visits, we got to go to places that Americans usually don't go, meaning beyond Beijing and Shanghai. And they flew us on their military transporters deep into China. And the thing that was on my mind, this is how it must have felt in Germany circa 1935. The future belongs to us.
So you're
Remember
saying
that
that's China,
song?
not Russia.
China,
That
China,
that
not
that
Russia at
that
all.
that's the
Not Russia
buildup.
at all. And
Yeah.
and you would talk to people, and young people do speak English, but you also have good interpreters. And I spoke Russian to a lot of people who studied in the former Soviet Union, so they are fluent in Russian. So that was kind of funny because I never thought I'll use my Russian fluency in China. But the line across the board was you, America, had your turn in the sun. It is our turn now. And it
Okay.
was chilling. It was chilling. Again, like I forgot which movie this line comes from. That you have this young Hitler Jugend boy, 16,
Yeah.
singing "The future belongs to us."
I've seen that in Chinese videos, and it's been reported that that's pervasive. That's part of their educational system. I'm not sure about that. I've seen that. Another thing that's been reported on is a series of very anti-Western military promotions, right? Join the Chinese military, blow up Westerners. And I think
Yes,
they've targeted Americans in a few of those, but the commercials themselves are basically just anti-West. So
right,
there
right.
is rhetoric, right? But there's always rhetoric.
Again, interesting, right? Russia will never, even now, with the relationship in the toilet, have a commercial about fighting Americans. It's culturally not within their frame of reference.
Hmm.
They would say the West, which is kind of amorphous, but you would not have this in your face. Hey, I joined the military to kill Americans, which
Yeah.
you do have in Chinese propaganda constantly. Meanwhile, we have men in high heels in our recording commercials, but that's an aside.
Well, and that's yeah, that's completely off my. One of the things that I've seen is politically, right? We have conservative and liberal factions in our own. Yeah, and one of the things that I have wondered is that the liberals constantly accuse Trump of authoritarianism, right? And and then conservatives have their own accusations against the liberals. One of the things I've wondered if this back and forth between liberalism and conservative authoritarianism, maybe that's just a natural part of all societies, right? And
I would say
sometimes it
it
goes out of
is.
control. You
I
know,
would say it is. However, it is in the United States. Russia, sorry, historically was never a democracy.
mm,
China, historically, was never a democracy. So this is typical of us. This is why Russians have always been concerned with our inconsistencies because, our policies are not long term, they're election driven. And at the change of an administration, you very often have a 180 turn.
Well, and in America, I think two other defining things are we don't trust government in general. We never have, right? And so when you look at like the Department of Government Efficiency, the Elon Musk thing, that makes
Sure.
perfect sense. That is an American institution because we don't trust our institutions, right? Whereas with China, definitely they are more regimented socially, right? There's a hierarchy that's been there for a
Yes,
long time.
very, very much so. Um, in Russia, however, they don't trust their institutions either. And you would hear it from the top officials. The government is too bloated, it's too bureaucratic. Even though theirs is much more streamlined than ours, so that this trust in big government we actually have in common with the Russians, not so much with the Chinese.
So maybe Russia should be the 51st state. Then that would solve the Canada
Too
Greenland
big.
issue.
11 time zones. Too big.
Well,
Too.
we could call it like Alaska plus. There you go. Well, the takeaway from things you've talked about in the past, and from my own research, Russia does seem very similar in many ways to the United States. I mean, it's a large federation. It brings together a very diverse group of
Right.
cultures, right? And
Which most people don't realize, Tim, how diverse Russia is.
very
And
diverse. Yeah.
you know, the diversity of religions in Russia, I would say, is greater than in the United States.
Now, if the part of this that I think is probably most relevant is, again, I read this all the time in the media. People say Putin did this, Putin did that. It's Putin's unilateral control. He's steering the ship. And based on what I have read and what I know about Russia, again, big, diverse federation with a lot of interests. I personally doubt that Putin makes any unilateral decisions, right? Just like the United States, you have to get
Right.
political buy-off, you have to get
It's
people to
too
support
big
you.
to make unilateral decisions. So
Yeah.
there is a great Russian saying, Russian, not Soviet, dating back to pre-revolutionary days, basically saying the Tsar is in Moscow. We are here, meaning they don't get to control us, which
Yeah.
again is very similar in Peoria or, you name the American state that has exactly the same attitude. Washington is the swamp. We pay no attention to that. So
Yeah.
there is that, but there is a societal regimentation. Because of the harshness of the climate and living conditions in Russia, there is a social bond that I would say does not exist in the United States any longer. Now, you had it during, oh God, I'm blanking on the term. Oh, when we moved the population further and further west.
Oh, the Manifest Destiny, right?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I blanked. So there is that, during that time when you had people in covered wagons, taking their possessions and going into the prairies,
Yeah,
there was a lot of,
that was my ancestors. Yeah.
see, so there was a lot of social support. Today, you barely know your neighbors. Russia is more like the old times. Friendships are very deep because you can't trust everybody. So you're very selective who to interact with.
And part of that is, again, when we think of Russia, it's kind of like Canada, right? It's very similar to Canada. We see this enormous country and we say, oh
Right.
my God, they're so big, But so Canada has about 10% of the U.S. population. Russia has about half of the United States population,
Right.
right? And
And
I
really
don't remember their
not.
GDP, but yeah.
Yeah, but the other aspect that we forget about Russia is life expectancy in Russia is terrible, especially for males. And that's the result of drinking and smoking and pollution but it's a fact that
I
life expectancy is about 20 years lower than in the United States. So Putin is 72, I believe. The mean life expectancy for a Russian male, I believe, is 60 something. It
Okay.
is 75 in the United States. So that population gap is going to increase. Birth rates in Russia are lower than in the United States.
Well, and that is another factor. We were talking about global climate change earlier. I, I mean, global population decrease, right?
Right.
These declining birth rates. And I've read statistics that I think I would say the most balanced, say our population may level off and stay the same. Nobody's sure where that'll be. It could be 8 billion where we're at right now, could make it up to 11 billion. But there are a lot of scientists and demographers out there who believe that our population may decrease tenfold. And that's all nations on Earth. And so instead of having 8 billion people, you'd have 800 million, which would be a very, very different world than we can envision.
Well, so think about it. China, for decades, had the one-child policy, which resulted in complete skewing of the demographics.
Yeah.
So China has a very large tilt in its population of males
Towards males,
coming
yes.
of age because they aborted girls. When you could have only one child, you chose to have a male child.
Yeah.
So they aborted girls and drowned after they were born, but that's whole another story. But you have this social instability that almost inevitably comes about from a large contingent of males who can't marry because there aren't enough women. So what are you going to do? I mean, historically, trends like that drove war.
Okay.
So that's another thing to consider. Russia's birth rates are significantly lower than the United States. Single child families are the majority.
And Russia is losing so many men in Ukraine, right?
It is.
As is
It is.
Ukraine. And so
It
that,
is.
I mean, the Ukraine conflict is going to be a bell that continues to ring in terms of their demographics for
Yes.
decades.
Yes. Like World War II has been. I mean, the Russians lost 20 million people in
Yeah.
World War II. I mean, no country has suffered as much as Russia in terms of death toll. I mean, I always used to use this analogy. More people died in the siege of Leningrad, now Petersburg, alone, that the entire war casualties of the United States, Britain, and France combined.
Yeah, I remember that movie Enemy at the Gates
A
and
prime
with Jude
example.
Law, yeah, where
Right,
they give him the ammunition because they didn't have enough
right,
rifles. They give him the
right,
bullets and they say when the man in front of you dies, that's your rifle.
right. That wasn't, by the way, that was Moscow, that wasn't Leningrad. But siege of a city by the Germans, which the Red Army finally broke after nearly 2 years, cost more people than the United States, Britain, and France lost in the entire war. I mean, it's, you kind of need to set up and pay attention. Putin's entire family perished. I'm not trying to humanize him. I'm saying you got to understand the enemy, where he is coming from. He grew up in Leningrad, whose population was decimated in World War II.
Well, I think one of the things that makes it easier to demonize Russia compared to China is we are so economically linked to China. In fact, if we ever did get into a hot war with China, I'm not sure if either side would know what to do with themselves because so many of our technologies are made there, right? And this goes to the CHIPS Act and, bringing home technology sectors and things like
Absolutely.
that. But I mean, the Chinese are very, very reliant on us as their customers, right? That not just us, but Western nations that are allied with us as well. So we get our tech from them, and they make it, right? So I mean,
Excellent point. Absolutely excellent point.
we don't have that with Russia, though, right? I mean,
No, because the trade is minimal.
yeah,
I mean, what does Russia make that you want to buy? I mean, they don't make your iPhone, they don't make your dishwasher. So what, caviar, vodka, what else you going to buy? Diamonds,
and then
uranium.
natural gas
Right. Now,
yeah,
resources, yes, but the average person doesn't think where does the gas that you put in your car come from. But
yeah,
everybody is looking at the iPhone and made in China, right?
yeah.
So they couldn't possibly be our enemy. So you have this perceptual prism that is warping and skewing how you look at the global security situation.
Yeah, there's so many perceptual aspects to this, and politically, I think it's convenience and expediency, right,
Yes,
have changed this, right? So, this week Russia is the bad guy, next week China is the bad guy, and and one of the things that I've learned from you over the several interviews that we've done is that all of these issues are incredibly complex,
yes,
and it's
yes.
difficult. You can't really draw a line in the sand and say good versus bad because it's a mixture on both sides and they all have relationships.
100%. But I diverted you when you started talking about the occupation of Georgia or the annexation of Georgia. And I told you that never happened. But you were going somewhere with that question. I didn't mean to divert you, but I did.
Well, I was wondering if you could look at Putin's moves as almost like a blitzkrieg in slow motion, right? And I
No.
think that might be what I was wondering was if that was a strategic concern is that, our defense planners, are they looking at that and saying, look, he was in this country, now he's in Ukraine, he's moving bases here and here, is he starting to expand the way that Hitler did in World War II?
Oh, absolutely not. And if you said what you said to a Russian, they would be horribly offended. They have not forgotten what Hitler did to them. We don't remember. We don't remember who
Yeah.
was our ally in World War II. And the reason you and I are not having this conversation in Russian is not because Private Ryan landed in, or Tom Hanks landed at Omaha Beach in Normandy. It's because the Russians kicked the Germans at Stalingrad and then in Kursk and facilitating our offensive, and then we met in Germany. So they were our allies. We don't want to
Yeah.
think about it, right? So that is a significant part of the Russian mindset. Now, Russia's geostrategic position, and again, maps are a good thing. Americans don't use maps. Maps are a good thing. Russia, if you look at the territory, 11 time zones, look where Moscow is located. Moscow has been supremely vulnerable over the centuries, right?
Yeah.
So I'll just bring 2 points. When Napoleon invaded in 1812, and Tchaikovsky wrote the overture of 1812, they burned Moscow to the ground so that Napoleon cannot get it. Hence the term scorched earth policy that originates from that. They burned the crops, they burned the city down, and then kicked Napoleon out of there. Hitler, the Wehrmacht, was stopped at the gates of Moscow. The movie The Enemy at the Gates is about the Battle of Moscow. If you visit Moscow today, you can still see, because they maintain it as a memorial, where the German panzers, the tanks, were stopped. Literally, it's now near the center of Moscow, because the suburbs just pushed
Grew
out.
up around it.
So
Yeah.
it was the outskirts in 1943 to 1942 to 1943. Today, the city expanded, obviously, so the memorial is almost centrally located. So to Russia, Moscow has to always be behind us. Moskva za nami. That goes back to Napoleonic times, to the great commanders of the 1812 Patriotic War against Napoleon, meaning we have to shield Moscow with a large land army and with a large cordon sanitaire, meaning like a defensive belt.
Okay.
So the enemy cannot invade the capital again. So Moscow has always, so we
siege
need to
mentality,
defend
almost.
forward. Say again?
Almost a siege mentality.
It is a siege mentality driven by their history. So you defend and maintain Moscow behind you by expanding forward. What have we done? We brought NATO right to where they retreated to when the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union have collapsed, right? So again, look at the map. Moscow is not very far from NATO's borders.
Oh, so Washington, D.C. was burned to the ground, right, in the War of
By the
1812.
Brits, right.
But in contrast, as Americans, we
Same
just
year,
forgot. So
think about it. That's another thing, that when you have a conversation with a Russian, They know our history. We don't know their history. A Russian will tell you both our capitals were burned to the ground in 1812. The difference is we did it to ourselves. Yours was done by the enemy. So right there you have, in a nutshell, a commonality and a huge divergence in perspective. And by the way, you mentioned Syria, talking about Russian forces in Syria. Russia no longer has forces in Syria. The Assad regime collapsed, as you know.
Okay, so that's changed.
Yeah, that's fundamentally changed. Russia invested a lot of money in the port of Latakia, which is on the Mediterranean coast, because it, along with Crimea, it's its only access to a warm water port. Has been a Russian objective since Peter the Great. So again, there is a history here. But again, if you're a nation that needs to trade, that needs to have a window to the West, its West, from its capital looking westward, it needs access to a seaport that is not frozen over the winter. Leningrad, St. Petersburg during Tsarist times and now, the port there is frozen in the winter. So you have ice. You can't move from there for trade or military operations. Well, now you can with icebreakers. So the quest for access to warm water port goes back to Ivan the Terrible, and then Peter the Great actually achieved that. See the Crimean War, and hence the issue of Crimea. Which Ukraine claims is its territory. I can make a pretty good argument it's not, historically. And again, Americans want to have kind of a expiration date on history. So anything that happened, draw your imaginary line, is inadmissible in an argument. That's a prescription to a good marriage.
For us, anything before World War II didn't exist.
Honestly, anything before that person who you're talking to, graduation from high school never happened.
Yes, I would say, I'm 49 now. And one of the things, I grew up kind of in the shadow of the Vietnam War, and it's scary how little is remembered about that by younger people.
Well, ask a young person about 9/11. You and I remember precisely where we stood when that happened. I remember where I was when Kennedy was assassinated. But you mentioned 9/11 now to somebody young, you'll get the deer in the headlight look.
Yeah, it was an event. It's not part of the reality. It was an event.
Completely not part of the reality.
I think the Cold War is very much the same way. I find it's nearly impossible to explain to younger people. I mean, I was at the end of the Cold War, and even explaining that, and that's very, very different than the 1950s, right? Like my mother did duck and cover drills. She's part of the silent generation. and they were actively worried about Soviet bombers dropping nuclear bombs. That was part of their daily reality was,
And rightly
is this
so.
going to happen?
And rightly so.
Yeah.
You see, which is why fighting Russia is not a good idea. It has been, remains, probably will forever be the only country on planet Earth that can destroy the United States in 30 minutes. And the fact that you'll retaliate really doesn't matter because you're dead.
Yes.
Or you wish you were dead because you're dying from radiation sickness.
That's one of my favorite childhood movies, War Games, Matthew Broderick, right? The computer figured it out in the end. The only way to win is not to play.
Right. That's precisely right. And yet we have been dancing on the edge of this abyss for the last 3 years.
Yeah.
I presume you read the New York Times expose about the extent to which the United States has been fighting a proxy war in the Ukraine?
I am not sure if I've read that, but I've read other authors, other articles that have kind of suggested that. So yeah.
But this just appeared, so it's Saturday, New York Times.
Okay.
Last Saturday, New York Times.
Have not read that one yet, but I will after.
Go to it. It's lengthy, and please call me and tell me, because I sincerely hope when you read it, you would say, wow, Lani said that. Wow, Lani said that. So you have for the first time an acknowledgement from the newspaper of record, the depth of America's involvement in a fight that's killing thousands of Ukrainians and Russians a day. We are calling the strikes. We are providing intelligence. It's a proxy war of the kind that we have never been in.
Yes.
Against a nuclear-armed country.
Well, yeah. So, Lani, on that note, I want to thank you so much for your time today. It has been a pleasure.
I love your podcast. It's such a pleasure to be interviewed by you. You're one of the most knowledgeable and prepared interviewers that I have ever interacted with.
Thank you.
So I truly appreciate it, Tim. And I'll be happy to come on your podcast any day on any subject.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Tim.